That's now 7:31. So as I say, you're all extremely welcome. Particularly welcome is, of course, Professor Chris Roe from the University of Northampton. Some of you will have heard his colleague Callum Cooper speaking last Tuesday extremely effectively. Chris is, I suppose, Callum's boss, as the boss of the very large parapsychology outfit at Northampton. And of course, they have undergraduates and they have postgraduates with whom he is particularly concerned. They produce PhDs in what I can loosely call our area, in parapsychology and the things that go around it. And, you know, a few weeks ago, I hosted Rupert Sheldrake, and I was really pleased to see him. He's probably, forgive me, a generation older than Chris. And he was the sort of person who had to do this, who had to leave academia in order to pursue scientifically parapsychological and spiritual things by himself. He's made a huge success of it, and he's written lots of books. Chris has also written books, but look how things have moved on since the founding of the Arthur Koestler Chair here in Edinburgh. Chris is heading up quite a big department with quite a lot of students, and we are not being sneered at. This is academia. And what I've always wanted, I mean, I've been in this on the fringes of this for 40 years. What I always wanted was to get this into academia. Now we have, and here it is in the person of Chris, and who's going to be talking to us tonight. I mean, I could read you the long list of Chris's editorships, publications, honors, and the fact that he's president of the Society for Psychical Research. You may assume that he's a big cheese, and I would very much hope you're going to enjoy listening to him and ask some questions if you wish. And his subject is recent developments in parapsychology about which he knows. So, Chris, can I invite you to speak to us?
Thank you, Lance, and thank you for the invitation. After an introduction like that, I'm tempted to say thank you and good night, to sort of leave on a positive. But I'm actually really excited to be able to talk to you all tonight and tell you a little bit about the kind of research that's currently going on in parapsychology across the UK, but also across the world, to give you a flavour of the approaches and methods that are currently being used to explore so-called paranormal phenomena. Lance and I had a bit of a chat about what we might want to focus on for tonight's topic. He mentioned that we've got quite a large group of researchers at the university. We have 9 full-time postdoctoral academics, members of staff, who have an interest in what we call exceptional experiences and consciousness studies. And so that ranges from parapsychology and an interest in the so-called paranormal, through to transpersonal psychology, which is especially interested in spiritual practices and experiences, all the way through to an interest in neuroscience and consciousness studies from a very mainstream perspective. That's wonderful, I think, because it shows that academics are able to talk to each other, and we may be able to find some common ground, even though at times we're portrayed as being at loggerheads with one another. So that's going to be the plan for today. I'll try and close that window down for me so I can show you my slides. So what do we mean by parapsychology? Apologies if this is old hat for you, but it's useful to start with the definition because it also gives you an idea of where we're coming from, how we understand the phenomena that we're working with, and how we propose to work with it. So our preferred definition is actually one by Caroline Watt, who's based at the University of Edinburgh at the Koestler Parapsychology Unit. She and Harvey Owen in their textbook write that parapsychology is the scientific study of experiences which, if they are as they seem to be, are in principle outside the realm of human capabilities as presently conceived by conventional scientists. So that's quite a mouthful, but there are a couple of really important features of it. First of all, the focus of parapsychology is the study of experiences. Whatever the ultimate explanation for the ontology of the experiences, whether we do need to think in new terms, whether there is a need to invoke a spiritual aspect to the human condition or not, so that bit may be debatable, that's under dispute. No one can doubt that very many people have experiences that they themselves label as paranormal, parapsychological, psychic, spiritual, and so on. This is really important because it means we do have a subject matter which is accepted across the board. We may disagree somewhat in the best way to account for those experiences, but the experiences are at least psychologically real and they're legitimate. They deserve our attention because they're important to the people who have those experiences. That does mean then that parapsychology is interested in what you might call what seems psychic but isn't. So we do need to have a good understanding of human psychology to understand the ways in which we might be deceiving ourselves or how we might deceive others, and to bring that kind of knowledge to the table as well, and not to be dismayed if we discover that certain classes of phenomena turn out to be better explained in conventional terms, as due to some fairly mundane or conventional mechanism that we already understand. However, and it's a big however, we're also open to the idea that science doesn't know it all as yet, that there are things where our understanding is fragile or fallible or partial, and that we may need to develop or expand our understanding if we're going to account for those experiences. So we are open to the idea that these phenomena require a radical rethink of the way we understand cognition, the way the brain and consciousness connect to one another, and what it is to be a person. So that those things might need to be revised. So with parapsychology, then we've got a broad sense of what the subject area is and how we might interrogate it. I wanted to mention in passing that the community of people who do parapsychology professionally, if you like, people who have credentials, who maybe work in university departments or get research grants to do this kind of work, is extremely small. We have a professional body called the Parapsychological Association. It produces its own journal called the Journal of Parapsychology, and they have criteria that you need to meet in order to be a full member. You have to have a PhD, you have to have published in some peer-reviewed journal on a parapsychological topic, and so on. And meeting those criteria, there are only 122 people worldwide who are professional members of the Parapsychological Association. I think it's really worthwhile to keep that in mind when you hear other people talk about the contribution that parapsychology has made in terms of the amount of human resources that are currently and historically have been devoted to its investigation. I'm sure if you heard Cal speaking last week, you're under no illusions about the idea that parapsychology is a taboo subject, and that the kind of monolith that is science protects itself from these radical ideas quite strongly. It is very difficult to eke out a living in this kind of a subject area. There are relatively few of us, and so we have to be realistic about the kinds of what would you say, the kind of developments that we've made, the kind of discoveries we might have made in the course of the time that people have been doing this kind of research. One colleague about 20 years ago made the comparison, and he discovered that the amount of human resources devoted to parapsychology in total was about the same as is devoted to social psychology in North America over one summertime. So from recess at the end of the third term through to the start of the new term, so those 4 months, that amount of human resource in one summer is the equivalent of all the time and energy that's been devoted to psychical research or parapsychology. I also wanted to give a plug to the Society for Psychical Research, which is the UK's equivalent of the PA. If you've not heard of the SPR before, I do recommend that you check it out and think about joining. Membership is relatively modest, and for that you get access to, again, talks like this from academics and other researchers. You get access to a journal and a magazine, and that allows you to feel part of the research community and keep abreast of more recent advances. So that's the plug over. We're still a small community compared with many other interest groups, but we're kind of dedicated. We're kind of hanging on in there despite adverse circumstances. So we're a small group. Our starting point very much in trying to understand phenomena is to develop some kind of a taxonomy. When people report experiences, do they have features in common that might tell us something about their character or nature or even their mechanism? Traditionally in parapsychology, those phenomena have been labeled as psi, PSI, and that's simply the Greek letter psi used in the algebraic sense to stand for something that we don't yet know or understand. So just as X might stand for an unknown in an algebraic equation, so we would use the term psi to denote something where we don't really quite know what's going on there. We need to investigate it more fully, understand its characteristics, and then start to speculate or theorize about what might be going on. That's really important because when people talk in terms of psi, we have to remember that's not the end of the journey. It's not as if we've discovered something and we can label it. It's very much the start of the journey that we've noticed that something doesn't quite fit with the conventional understanding of how people work and how psychology works. So the next step in the taxonomy is to break down the collective psi into its different types or components. And in parapsychology, traditionally, we have 3 different classes of phenomena. We have extrasensory perception, types of experience. This includes things like telepathy, so-called mind-to-mind communication. So for example, you might have somebody who suddenly has an embodied feeling, gets stomach cramps and suddenly thinks of their twin sister who was at that time in New Zealand and thinking, I think the baby's coming early. These feel to me like the early stages of birth, childbirth. And lo and behold, sometime later, they get a communication through to say, yes, indeed, your twin sister did start labor at that time. That would be an instance of telepathy, that kind of connection directly with another living person. Another kind of ESP might be clairvoyance, where we seem to pick up information directly from the environment in some way. So we might be able to, for example, locate a lost object, something like that, or to be able to perceive a scene that we've never seen before, and then suddenly when we see it later on, we can recognize it as it was in our experience. And also precognition, probably the most common type of ESP in practice, where people might, perhaps in a dream, have an experience that they later think comes true in the future. So at the time of the dream, the event didn't exist. But when the event later does happen, it seems to map onto the dream that they had about it. And all of those, what they seem to have in common is the idea that people seem able to acquire information from their environment in ways that go beyond the conventional means. That is through our various senses, our sight, our hearing, our taste, and so on, and also logical inference based on information that we do have. So it seems to go beyond that. We seem to know things that we shouldn't ordinarily know. Psychokinesis seems to involve information transfer in the opposite direction. In these, through an active intention alone, we seem to be able to have an impact on the world around us. So we don't need to use our own psychomotor systems. Now, it's a trivial thing. If I want to cause a table to lift, all I need to do is walk over to it and use my muscles to lift up the table. So that isn't particularly interesting. But if I can do it from a distance where it's very clear that I haven't been using my psychomotor system, then suddenly that might be a type of psychokinesis. And when we see an incident, which is quite obviously paranormal in that sense, so if we see a levitating object, for example, like in a poltergeist case or something like that, then that would be described as macro psychokinesis or macro PK. We don't tend to see that, unfortunately, in the laboratory, although at times people like Uri Geller have been invited into the lab and they've produced effects that seem quite interesting. Uri Geller has a very varied career. Sometimes it seems as if he practices cheating, and on other occasions he seems to do really well when cheating doesn't seem to be possible. So it's very difficult to know what to make of that. But some of his phenomena would fit in with the idea of macro PK. Again, we're using that term in the algebraic sense to label the type of thing that's going on, the type of experience, not necessarily concluding that, yes, indeed, this was paranormal. In the laboratory, we don't tend to see that kind of stuff. It tends instead to be that we see statistical deviations. So people are doing a little bit better at a task, a mechanical task, than they should be by normal means. And probably the classic example of that would be that J.B. Rhine, a famous researcher working in North Carolina in the US from the 1930s onwards, he did a lot of dice rolling experiments where we know with kind of slightly weighted dice that you can use in casinos that all 6 faces are equally likely to show face up. And nevertheless, in some of his experiments, when people were asked to focus on the dice and cause them, for example, to fall with the 6th face upwards, would get more 6s than they should get by chance. Now, you couldn't see that on any particular trial because, you know, if you threw half a dozen dice, then now and again, just by chance, you would get 6 6s would appear. But if you do it repeatedly over and over again, you can use statistical analysis to see whether people are doing statistically better than they actually should be doing. And that will be a form of micro PK that would fit in with it. And then the third category, parapsychologists are very interested in, but it's quite a hodgepodge of a category, is evidence of survival. I'm going to say a little bit about research with mediums in a while, and that certainly is of interest to parapsychologists. but other kinds of phenomena that the person having the experience absolutely relates to the notion that we have some point of consciousness or a soul or a self that can survive bodily death and carries on in some form. Evidence for that might come from, for example, reports of reincarnation cases, people's reports from near-death experiences, or, for example, apparitional experiences that people might have had. So there's a variety, a fairly broad base of phenomena that are typically interpreted as suggesting survival of bodily death. So those are the kind of classic phenomena. Now, if you do have questions as you're going along, do please use the chat box. If there's something urgent, I'm sure Lance is monitoring that, or Scott, and they can let me know about any kind of interjection. If something's not clear, do let me know, and I'm happy to go back to it. So here's an example then of ESP, and maybe this is more of a PK or survival type investigation. This, I think, is still how people typically think of the research of parapsychologists. They imagine us doing these fairly long runs of tedious card guessing studies and counting up how many times you say wavy line or circle or square. Or we spend a lot of time investigating haunted locations or the sites of, yes?
Sorry, Chris. We can't see your slides if you're showing them.
I am showing them. How is that not working then? Can we share again, see if that might do anything?
Yeah, if you click share screen.
Okay, so if I go back to it. So, okay, if I click on you and then, no, I can't see any. Exit minimized. Here we go. So share screen again. Share. And then if I go to here, can you now see a slide with two photos on it? And the real key is if I go back a slide, can you see that?
Yes.
And you can see that. So that's really all I've shown. You've not missed much in terms of graphics. So we have this idea of psi, PSI, and we have the different types of phenomena that you have. This is Gaither Pratt. He worked with J.B. Rhine back through the 40s and 50s in particular, doing lots of these card guessing experiments. His participant seems really interested in it, at least for the time being. We use this with our undergraduates, and it is interesting for short runs, but they collected tens of thousands of trials with their participants, and it does get increasingly tedious and bears very little relation to the kinds of experiences that people have in their everyday lives. And it's very difficult to see what even success on something like this can tell us about the experiences that people are having. But equally, although some parapsychologists, and Cal Cooper from last week would be one example, although some have an interest in haunting investigations, that isn't a prime focus of interest for parapsychologists. Why might that be? Because scientific research often depends on having detailed control over the environment or circumstances under which you're doing your research. And inevitably, in conducting field research, you don't have that degree of control. And it's very difficult to manipulate factors or variables to see what effect it has on the phenomena in the real world. So people tend, where they can, to observe in the real world, but then bring back the core features into a laboratory setting instead. And hauntings don't really fit with that too well. Okay, so everyone can see these, hopefully. So I'm going to talk mainly about some of the research we've done at the University of Northampton to give you a flavor of what I see as the three key strands of research as currently practiced by parapsychologists worldwide. There has been, in recent times, a revival of interest in mediumship. So mediumship was absolutely the prime focus between the world wars and probably up to about the 1950s. There was still a great interest in mediumship. And then the focus shifted very much to the kind of card guessing studies and the laboratory-based experiments that Gaither Pratt would be an example of. And it very much fell out of favor. I would say from the mid-1990s, maybe the early 1990s, there's been a great upsurge in interest in mediumship. And that's in part because of technological advances that allows us to do research with mediums in much more sophisticated ways than was possible before. So I'll say a little bit about the stuff we've been involved in there. This is our new campus, by the way. The EECS group that we have, we've got 10 PhD students as well. I don't know if I mentioned those working with us on various projects. Some of those are absolutely focused on mediumship from a number of perspectives. It also seems likely that there's something important about altered states of consciousness. When people describe their spontaneous experiences, they very often report being in a mild altered state of consciousness. They might have been drifting off to sleep, they might have been meditating, they might be involved in a dull, monotonous task where their mind was wandering about, and suddenly, dramatically and unexpectedly, they get this striking experience that they think then relates to their twin who's having the baby, or their premonition about some future event. So we want to look at that. More recently as well, there's been a resurgence of interest in psychedelics. The government is becoming a little bit more open to the idea that with certain requirements being met, researchers can work with psychedelic substances again. And some of these are claimed to have healing properties, and particularly to induce states of consciousness that give people mystical or noetic insights that I think are really interesting to parapsychology. So maybe in a future lecture, I or somebody else can tell you particularly about the psychedelics work. And then the other area that's, I think, particularly interesting in modern times is the idea that people might be acting on psychically mediated information without knowing it. That it might act at a very subtle level, that they don't have profound experiences, they can't claim that they've had psychic experiences, but nevertheless, their future has been made a little bit better by acting on available information. So if that sounds a little bit cryptic, good, I'll explain more in a few minutes. So in terms of the first of those, the mediumship work, we've been very fortunate at Northampton in that we've, over about the last 20 years, built up a good working relationship with the Arthur Findlay College. This is the home of the Spiritualist National Union, and at the AFC, Stansted Hall here, they regularly welcome developing mediums and fairly experienced mediums as well from all around the world. They have a Swedish week, an Italian week, and so on with translators, and mediums come along to stay typically for 1 or 2 weeks in residence to take part in various workshops. So they're very interested in the work that we've been doing with mediums, particularly because it's quite sympathetic. It's not all about debunking mediumship. It's not all about proving it in objective scientific terms. It's also about understanding the experiences of mediums and what we would call the phenomenology, the subjective experience of having a connection with spirit, for example, and sharing that kind of understanding with practitioners who should be interested. So particularly mental health workers, counselors, and psychotherapists who might occasionally come into contact with people who report those experiences. And at the moment, they're incredibly sensitive to the idea that they might be reinforcing or endorsing something that they see as pathological. That's the way they've been trained as practitioners. But in fact, our central message is those people are psychologically often very healthy, that there are ways to tell the difference between pathologically mediated experiences and those people who might have a psychic sensitivity. And we've got quite a surprisingly positive reception from the practitioners that we work with. So because of that being the underlying message, the Arthur Findlay College and the SNU has actually invited us to set up a laboratory at their headquarters, and it's in this building here. And so we've spent some time over the last few years refurbishing this space to create a lab on site so we can work more closely with the mediums that come along to the various workshops. So this is the space that we have. It's divided into 2 elements. We have a central area that's colored in the light orange. And in that area, we've built a kind of a reception area. And this allows us to invite mediums to come along for them to share their stories. So how was it they came to become a medium? Did they have childhood experiences? What kind of response have they had from friends and family members? Can they describe the subjective experience of making contact with spirits? How do communications, how are they realized for them? How do they experience them? And we can document that and we can share that with academic colleagues. And then the other part of the lab is set up for more experimental work. So we have physical separation between the 2 blue bits, and we've got 2 laboratories that are set up here that allow us to do research where we could, for example, have a client sit in one room and we could have a medium sit in the other room, and that without any physical contact between the 2. And that rules out loads of normal explanations for how the medium might be getting information about the client in terms of nonverbal behavior, for example, or just being a good judge of character or personality based on the way people appear and present themselves. All of those things can be ruled out with a simple setup such as this. And there's a variety of experiments that have done exactly that. So what we've been doing at the Arthur Findlay College has been quite a few show and tell workshop events with mediums, just to introduce them to the idea of how skeptical commentators might explain away their claims. You know, well, you're not mediumistic, you don't have contact with spirits. The information you claim comes from spirit is actually coming from the person sitting in front of you. And we introduce them to checks and controls that would allow them to rule out those normal explanations. So if they're able to say, well, actually, no, I've done some telephone readings, for example, where the client or sitter is on mute, or I've done some readings where the client or sitter is in a separate room from me and screened off from me, then they're able to respond to those kinds of criticisms quite robustly. So we've illustrated that with a kind of a fun experiment that we've run with mediums on these courses. And this typically involves a group of mediums coming together and being aware that the researcher who's physically separated from them, through some random process, will identify a deceased person who is very well known. So they're famous in some way for whatever their achievements in life. They have since passed on, but they are available as a person that we can have information about. So through that random process, the experimenter then is able to pull up documentary information about that person and concentrate on them, so they can think about the life that they lived, the contribution they made, what their interests were, what their physical appearance is like, and also some information about the way in which they might have passed. The kind of material that a medium typically might provide for an evidential reading in order to persuade their client that their deceased relative is still with them in spirit. So the mediums have kind of bought into this. They really enjoy this as a kind of an experiment, a fun experiment. And so they would each go into their own personal space, do their preparatory routine that they might have, and they would then try and connect with spirit and get information that will help them to identify who this deceased person is. And again, they might give a physical description, they might give a psychological description, or they might say something about the way that person passed. And then what we do, rather than saying, okay, the person we were thinking of was Marilyn Monroe, how did you get on? And them going, oh my God, that's amazing. I was thinking of a woman, and Marilyn Monroe is a woman. That must be who I was thinking of. We actually present them with a more stringent test where we present them with a number of images that have been randomly selected, and they're told that one of these is the actual target and the other three are decoys. And so they go through their transcripts of the impressions that they've generated, and based on their knowledge that they have on Christopher Columbus, on Elvis Presley, on Winston Churchill, and on Marie Curie, they're able to say, well, based on the impressions I had, my hunch is that this is the person I think the experimenter was connecting with. This is the person that they were concentrating on. So clearly for the mediums, this isn't a test of mediumship. They're really testing a psychic link with the experimenter, but it's kind of a fun exercise that allows them to see how an experiment might work. It introduces them to the idea of physical separation, the idea of randomization to select a target, and the idea of having a collection to choose among so that any natural bias, any creativity in seeing connections is controlled for. What have we found with those fun experiments? Well, we've run 11 of those trials, and we've had various different famous people in spirit that have been part of the judging sets, and various different people, the ones in bold, have been the targets. And across those trials, we've had 6 direct hits. So on 6 occasions, they've picked the correct person as their number 1 choice as a group. And on 2 other occasions, they've picked the target as their number 2 choice. Twice it's been their number 3 choice, so not really so good. And on 1 occasion, it was their last choice, so they didn't do very well at all on that trial, that group. Interestingly, even for just a bit of fun under loose controls, the cumulative performance of our mediums is statistically significant. The likelihood of getting that number of hits across 11 goes is about 1 in 20, under 1 in 20. And in psychology, mainstream psychology, that's usually the threshold to say something is so unlikely by chance that it probably wasn't chance. It probably was something else going along. So because this is a bit of fun and it's for illustrative purposes for our mediums, we're unlikely ever to write this up. We'll carry on doing the exercise with other mediums, but it is, we think, very interesting that they're doing really well, even at that fun task. But the main thing we've discovered in working with our mediums is that although we tell them that science works in a variety of different ways, it's not just about objective experimental tests. It also includes things like interviews and surveys to explore the personalities of mediums. That can give us valuable knowledge that can help to legitimize the whole subject of mediumship research. Nevertheless, we've discovered they only want to do psychophysiology work. They only want to do brain investigations. So particularly looking at EEG measures and seeing how EEG might tell us something about how mediumship is practiced. Partly, this extends from amazing discoveries that when we've had mediums on platform giving demonstrations and we've continuously monitored their EEG, the information we get from their brain activity suggests that they're not on platform engaging with an audience or congregation, telling jokes and having a bit of banter, but they're in a relatively deep, relaxed state where they're introspecting. So we'd normally expect somebody with their EEG profile to be sitting relaxed in a chair with very few outside stimulations. So it's a very odd juxtaposition. And some of our mediums have been really reassured to see that when they enter trance, particularly anything that goes beyond what they would regard as a light trance, we see a physiological change as well. Because a standard explanation would be, well, it's just your imagination. You know, it's wishful thinking on your part. You think something's happening to you subjectively, but there's no evidence that anything at all is happening. Well, in fact, from the work that we've done with mediums, there's a very clear shift physiologically when people enter deeper states of consciousness. It's very clear that they're entering states that are analogous to what's called the hypnagogic state when we're drifting off to sleep, or the kinds of states of consciousness we see with practiced meditators, for example. So they find that really interesting, and that's what they want to do. So ultimately, we've given up and we've decided to do what they want to do. And we're in the process of collecting EEG data at the moment in an experiment in the lab that I just showed you. So that research involves reproducing or replicating a study conducted by Arnaud Delorme here and Julie Spatial that was done in California originally. They had two really neat features to their experiment. So they worked with mediums that they'd worked with before and that they had confidence in. They mapped their EEG as the mediums were asked to do various activities. And that included making contact with a named person and then bringing forward information from that person that could be evidential. So they tested 6 mediums, and of those, 4 provided information that was independently rated as accurate. And most interesting, 1 medium in particular produced highly significant changes in their EEG and their brain activity in the periods when they were producing accurate information compared with periods when the information was not accurate. And it particularly involved this area here. So these pictures are of a brain. I'll not show you that picture yet. So the top of that circle is the front of a person. So their nose is normally at the front. We're looking from a bird's eye view, top down, top of their heads. Often you'd have 2 little ears that would feature on the 2 sides here. So this area here is just above the forehead. It's what's called the prefrontal cortex. It's the area that's most associated with rational or logical thinking. It's an association center where information from various parts of the brain are brought together to create our conscious experience, but particularly the kind of ego I personality who seems to be overseeing it all and responsible for making sense of it all. And so what we see here is frontal theta, and theta is a rather deep state of consciousness, a very relaxed state of consciousness where people's thinking isn't very clear and linear. It's much more kind of creative and spontaneous. So that's quite fun. And so we're looking to try and reproduce that. And we're also at the moment looking to reproduce another finding, which was that when Delorme and his colleagues asked the mediums to imagine a person, so to create a person that has never existed, but imagine what that person might look like, what kind of interest that person might have, and so on. And in another exercise, they asked them to remember somebody that they really knew, somebody who has lived, that they've met in real life, and just think about that person and picture them in their mind's eye. So what does that person look like? What do you know about them in terms of their interests? And then a third condition, they bring spirit forward and they connect with spirit and they sit with that person. So they sit with the way in which that person looks, that person's personality, and so on. And really interestingly, what they found was that the EEG characteristics, the profile, is different in those three situations. So whereas a skeptical commentator might say, when a medium is bringing spirit forward, they're just imagining things, or they're just dredging up from using their creative capacity, memories of real people that they've known, and they're constructing these impressions. That doesn't seem to be the case, because their brain activity is very different in those three situations. So we're hoping with our UK collection of mediums to be able to reproduce that effect. So data collection is ongoing. EEG data is notoriously difficult to analyze. It takes ages to crunch all the numbers, but we hope within the next year or so to be able to report on the definitive findings from that experiment. Now, the other two areas that I hope I've got time to explore with you. So we started at past. I've got maybe until about 25 past, 20 past, with Lance's permission. I've got a nod. That's fabulous. I just want to tell you about two other areas that we spent a lot of time researching. So the first of these then is the idea of altered states of consciousness being important. This derives from what I mentioned before, the idea that when people report spontaneous experiences, so people who are not especially psychic, but they have one or two profound things that have happened in their lives, very often it's linked with dream states or meditative states and things like that. And this is particularly related to this lady here. This is Louisa Rhine. She was the wife of J.B. Rhine, but she importantly gained her PhD in botany before J.B. got his. She got her PhD in about 1926, something like that. So she was very much in the vanguard. And botany was a fabulous PhD to have at that time, because they were in the vanguard of statistical analysis. They were doing lots of genetics work at that time, inheritance of characteristics from strains of plants to other strains, the next generation. And it meant that they were really well versed to use statistics in their psychology work, working with people who had psychic claims in a way that regular psychologists didn't have. In those days, psychologists were more philosophers than experimentalists. So that's been really handy for us. So she collected all of these cases that came in, and this was her impression, very strongly, that altered states of consciousness seem to be important. Now, our problem with spontaneous cases is they're quite easy to explain away. They don't really stand up as evidence. Because we weren't there and we don't know the circumstances, it's very easy to speculate that, of course, this lady might have had a dream of a warehouse fire, and later on there was a warehouse fire that seemed to match the dream. But we don't know how often this lady dreams about warehouse fires, and we don't know how many fires there are in the country in any particular year. There are nearly 70 million of us in the UK and New Zealand. And among those 70 million, we all dream every night, and stuff happens in the world the next day. So we should expect rather unusual coincidences to happen every now and again, and for it to be just down to chance. The chances of winning the lottery are astronomical, and yet quite often somebody somewhere in the UK does win. So we have to be aware of that we're making something seem special when it's not. It's just a chance coincidence. And that's not helped by the self-selection of cases, because when we invite people to tell us about premonitions, we're drawing from a very large sample. If we do an online or a newspaper survey, there might be literally millions of people who could respond, and we might only hear from a few hundred who do bother. And so they're very much cherry picking the very best possible cases. But if it's just down to chance coincidence, you would see that kind of distribution anyway. You'd have some few people who have remarkably similar coincidences without us having to infer that there was anything special going on. But also in the real world, there might be shared antecedents. So we'd be less impressed by this lady's account if we later discover that she was the health and safety officer for this particular warehouse. We might then wonder whether perhaps on her rounds around the building, at some subtle level perhaps, she became aware of a problem. That big pile of newspapers next to the boiler, that looks a little bit dangerous. And the way that that came to bubble through to consciousness was through a dream that she had. So her worrying about it kind of blew up to say, well, what if, what might happen? What's the worst possible scenario? And lo and behold, it really happened. So that in fact, both events had a common core. They had a common cause back in time, which was the newspapers next to the boiler. And there might be other problems, maybe sensory leakage. Maybe she has a clock radio and the clock radio switches on while she's still asleep, and it reports a news item about the fire, and she assimilates some of that into her dream, but unconsciously she knocks off the alarm to give herself 15 more minutes. And when she does finally wake up, she remembers the dream, but not the radio coming on and not her switching it off. And very finally, testimony is notoriously weak. Eyewitness testimony for important events isn't very reliable, and confidence in your testimony is not a good indicator of accuracy. And here then what we might find is once she sees the fire on TV, she recalls elements of her dream that fit with the experience and forget the elements of her dream that don't fit. And likewise, she may notice things in the event that fits with her dream and fail to notice bits that don't fit with her dream. And so we get this kind of a convergence of the features. So both are made to seem more alike than they truly were. How do we deal with that? We start in the real world, we identify these counter explanations, and we build those into our experiments as controls to effectively rule them out as explanations. So with dreams, for example, some researchers have used dream laboratories where you can monitor people's brain activity and you can know when they're having dreams. If you want to find out more, I can tell you in questions. When they're dreaming and hooked up to the device, we could randomly select a target for them, so say this Greek fishing boat, and we show that to a sender. And the sender concentrates on that image and tries to communicate it to the lady in some way. Perhaps they're related to one of them, but there may be a couple. And so he might reminisce about the Greek holiday they took together and the fun that they had on that holiday, all the happy memories that they share. And then when she's gently awoken through her dream, she's asked to describe what she can remember of that dream. And we hope that some of the content relates to the target, that it would allow her to identify the target. She falls back asleep and we repeat that cycle again in her next dream period. And most people dream perhaps 3 or 4 times in a typical night. Each dream is maybe about 40 minutes. Within a 90-minute cycle, it might be a bit shorter actually, maybe 30 minutes in a 90-minute cycle, and we start again. So we have that going on. And then in the morning, we've got a written record of those dreams, and we can use that to make a judgment. And we'll look at that in a second. Now at Northampton, we don't have access to a dream lab, and equally, we don't have access to too many participants who might be willing to give up a whole night's sleep just for the good of science. So instead, we and others have devised a method in which people sleep at home as normal. They sleep in their own homes, but while they're safely away in the laboratory at the university, which is all locked and secured and alarmed, a computer is set up to randomly select a video clip, and it will play that video clip through the night. All the participant needs to do, they're aware that this is their target, and before they go asleep, they give themselves a gentle wish to dream and to remember their dreams, and for those dreams to help them to identify the target. And we hope that they have those dreams. That's a good dream they're having there, good correspondence. And they record the dreams in the morning. They keep a dream diary, and they bring that into the laboratory. And just as I've explained before, rather than simply show them the video that was their target that played through the night and say, what do you think? Do you think that connects with your dreams? Because creatively we will see connection. We show them 4 alternatives, one of which is the target and 3 are decoys, and nobody except the computer knows which is which. So the experimenters don't know either, and there's no way in which they can cue the person to the right answer. And their task is to simply rank order them. Well, based on my dream, I think this is the closest correspondence, so I'll put that as my number 1 choice. I'll put the Titanic sinking, that'll be my number 2 choice. The spider's web and the volcano is my least favored choice. So just as we saw before with the mediums and their deceased personality. What do we find when we do experiments like that? Well, at Northampton, we've done a few of those, and we know that if there's no correspondence, if dreams are just dreams and they don't help you to identify the target, you would put the correct video as your number 1 choice just 1 time in 4, or 25% of the time. Without belaboring the point with lots of statistics, here's the data from a bunch of experiments that we've done. Collectively, across all of our experiments, the hit rate is not 25%, it's just over 31%. So that doesn't sound like a great deal. It's nudging a little bit higher, but keep in mind, that statistics works a little bit like the gravitational pull of a planet. The larger the number of trials, the harder it is to deviate from chance expectation at all. So with this number of trials, it's really difficult. We've got, I think, how many trials have we got altogether? 223 trials. It's really difficult to shift away from the chance expectation of 25%. And in fact, the odds against chance of getting this number of direct hits is already less than 1 in 50. Another technique that we've used at Northampton with altered states of consciousness is called the Ganzfeld. And I don't know if any other speakers have described this to you in the past, but this is really useful as a means of inducing in people a very mild altered state. People get very relaxed, quite sleepy. Their thinking becomes a little bit non-linear and a bit more paradoxical. So they might start to have experiences where you go through your office door and suddenly you're on a beach in Tahiti and you don't pass any remarks. That just seems like the most normal thing in the world. So your logical linear thinking mind is kind of disengaged a little bit in this process. It looks very peculiar. It's very photogenic for documentaries and for newspaper articles, but it involves basically placing eye shields over the participants' eyes and shining a red light in their face. They keep their eyes open and all they see is a diffuse red light that's got no pattern to it. And because the brain is being stimulated, but there's no information there, it encourages the brain to imagine things. And so quite quickly, after about 10 or 15 minutes, people start to see snatches of imagery. So they might see a flickering eye, they might see running legs, or they might see a fleeting a car moving past or something like this. And all we do is we ask the participants to report on any experiences that they have while they're in the Ganzfeld. He's also got headphones on, Simon here. And over the headphones, we play white noise, which is like the hiss between radio stations from the old days when you used to have to dial by hand. Again, it's kind of a random noise. There's no pattern to it, but it's stimulating. So it keeps the brain active, but kind of shrugging its shoulders effectively because there's no information there. And again, because the brain craves stimulation, it creates its own. And so it starts to embed in the noise its own stimuli. So you might hear a snatch of music in there, or you might hear environmental sounds like a train chugging past or something like this. And it's all purely your imagination. And as the Ganzfeld period continues, the imagery can build up. So you can have quite dramatic scenes. You can have things which are quite vivid and detailed, but they're all coming from your own unconscious. And people don't feel ownership of these experiences. They seem quite random and surprising to them. It's quite a fun experience to go through. And they report on the experiences they're going along. And we see this as having some parallels with sleep and dreams. In our experiments, we've done a couple of things that are key. So there you can see Cal from last week and some other researchers that we've worked with on these projects. We typically use a precognitive design. So somebody will come into the lab on campus, we'll go through that technique. So they'll be very relaxed, they'll start to have imagery, and they'll have a gentle wish to have the imagery relate to a future target that they'll see later on. They produce all their imagery and we record it, audio and by hand. After they've finished, we'll go through the imagery with them. And then the computer randomly chooses a target from them from a set that we have. And for the targets that we have, we use geographic locations that we think are interesting. So this is the Vatican in Rome. And because this is on Google Earth, it's possible to interact with the site. So you can't really see on this display, but it's a more of a kind of pseudo three-dimensional image. You can zoom in and zoom out, and you can look at things from different angles or perspectives. You can click on these little blue buttons, and they will show you photographs that people have taken from exactly those locations. And so it's more of an immersive kind of experience for people. Now, in our experiment, we show the participant only the target. So that literally becomes their future. But we give the description that they've given while they were in the Ganzfeld, we give that to an independent judge. And the independent judge gets the description and 4 alternatives. So 4 target locations, one of which was their actual location. And then they do the judging on their behalf. What do we find from those experiments? Well, again, 25% is what we should be getting by chance. But here at Northampton, we're getting a hit rate of just over 39%. And the chances of that kind of a hit rate or about 1 in 1,000. So again, we're quite confident that even in situations where we have lots of checks and balances, we're pretty sure that those standard normal explanations can't explain away the evidence that we're accumulating. People are still doing better than they should be doing just by chance. This isn't just a chance-based rate. These are all the trials that we've ever done using that method. And that's the overall hit rate. So we're kind of running out of time. I just want to describe one unconscious method that we've used. So there's some lovely work looking at physiology. So sometimes it appears as if our body knows things that our mind doesn't. And so we've done quite a bit of work looking at physiological responses to things that lie in your future. Dean Radin here is a key researcher in this area. So you can measure physiology by putting sensors on somebody's hand, on the skin, and it passes a very mild electric current across the surface of the skin, and it effectively measures how sweaty your skin is at any particular moment, and that's directly related to physiological arousal. In that situation, if you clap your hands, suddenly you'll see a spike in people's physiology, the galvanic skin response, as it used to be called, their electrodermal activity, we call it now. If you whisper a name that's meaningful to them, they react in much the same way. Dean and colleagues have done various experiments where they've shown people pictures that they would react to and pictures that they shouldn't react to. They're fairly dull, but they're not very emotional. And in those experiments of Dean's, they find the traditional effect over here. So your physiology is different after having seen an arousing picture. So that might be a picture of a car accident, for example. And it's different, it's higher, your reaction, than it is when you're shown a picture which is pretty dull or neutral. So far, so ordinary. That's what we'd expect from mainstream psychophysiology. But what Dean and other colleagues have found is that there is a much smaller, but still highly statistically significant effect occurring over here. Where's over here? This is in the period before the image has appeared on screen. It's actually before the computer has decided what image to show. So there's no information available for people to react to. It doesn't yet exist. It only exists in their future. Nevertheless, ordinary people, not people who claim to have lots of psychic experiences, people like you and me, present a differential effect. We're calmer before we're about to see a calm picture than we are when we're about to see an arousing picture. And other people have found that effect. The final bit I do want to talk about is the idea that, as well as in our physiology, maybe psychically mediated information is unconscious, but it can still affect our decision-making or our judgments. I'm very happy to come back another time and tell you especially about Daryl Bem's research on this, which has caused quite a furore, published in a very high-profile mainstream journal that reports exactly these kinds of effects. But for the time being, I'll just tell you about one of our studies, which also relates to the idea that people can sometimes be psychic without having any knowledge of it. It relies on Rex Stanford's psi-mediated instrumental response model. That's also a bit of a mouthful, but basically all that this model says is that people will respond instrumentally. They'll behave in ways that have outcomes for them which are positive. They get to encounter rewards and they get to avoid punishments. So you linger in the bookshop for a little bit longer browsing, just for no particular reason, but then just as you leave the bookstore, you bump into that person who later becomes a romantic partner or somebody who gives you a job at a time when you're between jobs. So those kinds of coincidences may in part be due to us acting on unconscious information. So we wanted to test that in the lab. So the way we did that was we recruited participants to do an ESP task, but we said that the ESP task involves looking at these abstract pictures. And before we begin, we just want to get a sense of what kind of preferences you have, you know, because we find that some people like some pictures, other people like other pictures, so we need to match them up properly. And so we show people a set of 4 like this, and we say, which one are you drawn to? Which one do you like the most out of those images? And we'll use these later on when we do the ESP task. And so, I don't know, at the moment, I like image 2 the best out of those 4. Click on number 2 and move on. And we have 10 trials like that, each with abstract pictures. that are pretty well matched, and you just pick out the one that you like the most. In fact, it turns out that this is the ESP task. They're precognition trials. At the time that you make your choice, they're all equally likely to be the target, but after you've made your choice, the computer randomly chooses one to be your target, and then it tots up how many you got right. So out of 10, how many times did you pick the image that the computer went on to pick? So by chance, you should get 2.5 right out of 10, because it's a 1 in 4 again. So if you score below 2.5, so you've not done well, you've scored below average. Oh, wrong way. If you score above chance, we'll do it this way. So you get more than 2.5 right out of 10, we give you a reward. So we show you humorous cartoons, or we show you erotic pictures, and we get you to rate how humorous the pictures are, or how much you like these erotic pictures. And then we do later on an exit poll, and we find out whether you like the task or not. And the better you do on that task, the longer you get to do the rewarding task. So you get to see more funny cartoons or see more erotic pictures and so on. If you've done badly at the task, we punish you by giving you a really dull cognitive task. We show you random sequences of numbers, and you have to monitor these. And every time there's a sequence of 3 odd numbers or a sequence of 3 even numbers, you have to press a space bar. So you have to keep watching and noticing. And you might do this for 10 or 15 minutes, and it gets increasingly dull and boring. And again, it is a punishment. The longer you have to do it, the less you like having to do that. So that works really well. In fact, those are the contingencies. So that's really the reward or the punishment. And we're interested in finding out how many people did better than chance. How many people picked the right targets, even though they didn't know it was a psychic task, but it inevitably led to them doing something interesting or nice rather than something dull and boring. And what we found, working particularly with David Luke, who's now at Greenwich University, is that people do avoid the dull task. They avoid the punishments and get to do the rewarding task. And of the 3, this gives us the strongest effect size. So here, the odds against chance of these results is about 1 in 10,000 across this number of trials. Is what, about 100, nearly 200 trials there, something like that, that we've done. So again, we're seeing evidence under conditions where it's very difficult to explain away in conventional terms what's going on. But in this experiment in particular, people have no expectation that they're being psychic. They're not having to work or perform in any way. It's very clear that all they're doing is picking out the picture they're drawn to that they kind of like more than they like the other 3. And that's where we are. So people report lots of experiences that they describe as psychic. And we can explore that in different ways across these different paradigms. So I hope that's given you a flavor of the approaches that we use at the University of Northampton. Hope some of that was interesting. And I'd be really happy to come back another time and tell you a little bit more in a bit more depth about it or some of the other research that we've been doing. Very aware of time. I hope I haven't overstayed my welcome, Lance.
Not in the least. Thank you very much indeed. What clarity and what a lot of stuff there. And you packed it in. Now, we're not going to remember the details, but the general picture that I've got, and I'm sure everybody else has, is of a very vibrant research environment in which you're doing very detailed and specific and highly mathematized things. Which encourages us to feel that out there are people who aren't just having the feelings that we have about spirit and our psychic abilities and so on, which some of us have and some like me have less of, but that there are people trying to demonstrate it and understand it. That's absolutely great. I've got a couple of questions here. Oh, actually, that's quite interesting. Oh, gosh. Okay, so, well, Brigitte asked, has your notion of the nature of consciousness changed during the time you've been dedicated to psychic research? Do you think consciousness is different now from what you originally thought?
Probably not, but I think my confidence in the evidence base that supports that notion is stronger. I think it's not a new term to think in terms of extended mind, and I think absolutely any living human being under the right circumstances can demonstrate that they have that deep interconnectedness with other living beings and with nature and with the world around us. The secret to it is to be sensitive to where that evidence might lie. and then to apply that critical scrutiny to it and think about ways in which we might be able to transplant it into lab settings so that we can have evidence that is protected against the standard dismissals. Our big problem always, I think, in talking to skeptical colleagues is how easy it is to just swat away particular claims. You know, oh, well, that's clearly just coincidence, or clearly that's wishful thinking or selective recall, etc. That's really why it's important to honor people's lived experience, but use that as a starting point to inform what we actually do in the laboratory, where we have more control.
Yes, I get that. And the question was specifically about consciousness. I mean, I always think that consciousness is a kind of absolute. Either you are or you aren't. There aren't very many shades of awareness.
Yeah, so I guess I'm more in the kind of Aldous Huxley camp. Something like Charlie Tart would be another researcher who suggests that there are different states of consciousness, and they give us differential access to reality. So there isn't just one reality, which is the reality we encounter in our normal waking state. But there are other realities that we might be able to access in other states of consciousness. I'm a great believer in the releasing valve kind of notion, that the primary function of the brain is to restrict the nature and type of information that comes to conscious awareness. Because it's functional, it allows us to survive for millennia when we had to hunt and gather and so on. It's less useful to us now in a technological society, a technological age. But those functions mean that there's not much value in being able to sit and meditate and engage on some of those deeper things very often. We might have privileged persons, shamans in our community who do that on behalf of a tribe or a community, but individually, it's probably best for us to be in the here and now, to make sure there's food on the table and a roof over our heads.
Of course, that's consciousness indeed. I've got a short question, which only I think needs a short answer. Two people have asked, why do you use a red light in Ganzfeld, I presume they mean, and is it imaginary, or is it the sun, the light of the sun, is it infrared, for example?
It is psychological, so people have used other shades for the lamp that they might use, and they find that they instill a different emotional response. So the analogy I often draw is it's very like being on a summer holiday on a beach somewhere with your eyes closed, and you can almost imagine the sun beating down on you, and you feel just really chilled and relaxed. We sometimes, for example, have a little exercise, a psychological exercise before a trial where we say to people, what I want you to do is to write down on a piece of paper all the concerns and preoccupations that you have today. So the row that you just had with somebody before you came out, the exam that you have at the end of the week and so on. Write them all down and then symbolically put them to one side. So for the duration of the experiment, they're over there, they're not sitting with you. You can just be engaged in this task. At the end of the experiment, it's your choice. You can either pick that piece of paper up and put it back in your pocket and re-own all of those worries, or you can chuck it in a wastebasket. But in that moment, you're just immersed in the experience. And I think things like the red lights really help with that, in just helping people just to let go. Because I think very often it's very easy for people to be slightly on edge and thinking, I'm in an experiment, there are people listening to what I say, they're writing things down, I've got to perform in some way, I've got to be successful, all of which is counterproductive. You know, in the Ganzfeld, the stuff we tell to participants is, it's a little bit like falling asleep. You know, the night when you really need to go to sleep because you've got an early start and you're wide awake, you can't force yourself to sleep. But what you can do is you can let go of the worrying about going asleep, and it'll take care of itself. And, you know,
and red assists with that.
Well, it does, because it induces that kind of relaxed state.
Okay.
So people feel more comfortable. And I want another word besides relax, that there is a concern, because with the eye shields and the headphones, you're rather vulnerable. You know, if somebody came sneaking into the lab, for example, you wouldn't even know they were there. So it's really important that you feel comfortable in that situation, and you can kind of settle into it and let go.
Okay, thank you.
Helps with that.
Gavin Ritchie, one of our most faithful attenders, says, yeah, he thanks you very much, and thanks you for the fabulous work you're doing at Northampton. Do you have any thoughts on failed replications and surrounding skeptical analysis Darrell's study, Feeling the Future study, you know, and some criticisms such as the limitations of p-value analysis and problems with the researchers' degrees of freedom seem applicable to so much of psychology and perhaps all of science. So I wondered what that left the BEM study, in your opinion. Quite a technical question.
Okay, so replication is really important in science. So when one researcher or one laboratory makes a discovery or a finding, it's really important that other laboratories try and reproduce that method to see if they can get the same outcome. And this works wonderfully well within very tight bounds of variation in the natural sciences. So physics, chemistry, biology work very well with that kind of a model. It works much less well in the social sciences, because our subject matter with respect to those other disciplines is much, much more complicated. So I'll give you a quick example of that. I made a profound discovery during my PhD when I found that some of my participants were doing their own experiments in my experiment. So when I debriefed them after the experiment was over, I discovered that they'd come along with particular thoughts and expectations about what the study was about. They played around with what was going on, so they behaved in particular ways to see what the outcome would be. And so they were testing their hypotheses in my experiment. So the idea that you've got a uniform subject matter in the same way that you do in a chemistry lab or a biology lab is just completely untrue.
Of course.
So in social sciences, we rely on something called statistical replication. So that's the idea that if you have an accumulation of results from various places, not everybody will get the same result. But if you look at it collectively, you'll find that you get a nice Gaussian or normal distribution, and that whole distribution will be shifted. So an example I use with the undergrads is there are genuinely sex differences in linguistic and visual spatial ability. If you took an average male and an average female, the average female would be slightly better at verbal tasks than the average male would be. But when you look at the distributions, there's so much overlap that that's no use to you in practice whatsoever. There are thousands and thousands of men who would be more verbal than any particular woman, and thousands of women who would be more visual spatial than one particular man. And so as a result of that, that means that when you say, I want to test whether there truly is a sex difference for verbal ability, sometimes you will find the difference, and on some trials you won't find the difference just because of the people that have participated.
Yes.
So the same is true in parapsychology, and this is really important to stress because people do say that we can't replicate in parapsychology, and that's singularly untrue. If people take nothing else away from today, take this away. Parapsychology effects reproduce to exactly the level we would expect, given the size of the effects that we have and the sizes of the experiments that are designed to look for them.
That's an interesting and confident statement. Can I try you on a couple more questions before we finish? Julie Lindsay's asked, well, she said her experience of ESP does not involve clairvoyance,
right?
But it involves what she calls her psychic side of things. What did you mean? It doesn't involve
well, but the way I am as a physical medium, my psychic side is more towards my telepathy. That's my sixth sense, which everyone, I believe, my belief is everyone on the planet has a sixth sense. That's your natural sixth sense. That some people have it really a lot, like I do. Some don't have it so much. Whereas my clairvoyant side is nothing to do with telepathy. That's me communicating with spirit. Do you agree, Chris? Am I on the same par as you?
We're not on the same page, but that's, I think, because we're describing different uses of those terms. I think absolutely my medium colleagues, we've worked with very closely for many years, absolutely have a different they use the term clairvoyance in a different way from the way in which we might use it in our experimental work.
Oh, I see what you mean. So you're coming from a different
I think so.
Direction.
Exactly. So mediums very often report that when they have communications coming through, they might experience them in different ways, and they label them in ways that make sense. So they might have embodied feelings. So particularly you might struggle to breathe, for example, if the person coming through died because of some kind of lung or chest condition. So those are very common features. And for those mediums, they might describe that as clairvoyance rather than, for example, having a very heady or cognitive kind of experience.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
So that would work in that way. I think in our research, and these are really only kind of operational definitions, they may not be very useful in the long run, but we tend to distinguish between situations in which people acquire information that only exists in the mind of another person.
Yeah.
And those situations in which it might be possible to get that information just because it exists in the environment somewhere.
Yeah.
You know, so that would be really what we're getting at there. I think the strongest evidence comes from those experiences. It's bizarre actually, but in Louisa Rhine's case collection, the strongest evidence comes from the least explicit sources. So people feel most compelled to act if their experiences are on the more vague but embodied side. A really good example of that is, I can't remember the general, was it General Lee, whoever accepted the Confederate surrender? He was due
no good at history.
Right. Well, whichever Unionist general that was, he was due to be honoured to have an occasion with the President Lincoln.
Yeah.
But during the day, his wife was becoming increasingly distraught, and was insistent that they went home because she felt her children were in danger, that there was some problem at home. They lived in the next state, and she insisted that they went home. You can imagine how socially embarrassing that is to turn down the president, you know, President Lincoln like that. That very night, President Lincoln was assassinated.
Gosh.
And he was due to be sitting with the president, and he was on, what's the name of the guy again? I've forgotten his name as well. The assassin's list of people he was out to get.
Oh, synchronicity, yeah.
So it's one of those situations where people are very commonly more likely to act on those embodied experiences, even if they're kind of ineffable. There's nothing you can say to another person to say, well, I imagined it in this way, and lo and behold, it was exactly like that. But they are convinced that these are real events, and they attest to the direct link we have with other living people.
Yeah, I find you fascinating, Chris. I do.
That's very kind of
you. Even though I've been, well, when I was younger, you were called, my daughter, she's that way inclined, meaning psychic, clairvoyant, whatever they called it in those days. But it's interesting because when I was 12, I was sent up to this huge building in London because my mother took me to the doctors, you see, and thought I was gaga or something. And my elder sister also, because we're all a bit gaga, and we were sent to this place in London. So I don't know if it's the same place that it's the psychical research place, because in those days they used to confuse, I mean, it's like you say, it's clearer now, the distinctions between the different things. But in those days, I think they confused ESP with, clairvoyance, clairsentient, whatever more the psychic side. You see, we have a saying, us psychics, you don't have to be clairvoyant to be psychic, because you can have one without the other, because I believe that it's just your sixth sense. But you have to be psychic to be clairvoyant.
That sounds right, Julie. Thank you very much.
So they sort of complement each other, don't they?
Yeah.
But yes, I find it fascinating. I'm going to try and listen to more of your lectures, Chris.
We hope we'll be getting Chris again, that's for sure. And he seems to be offering, although he may not have meant it. Two more questions which have come through, and then we'll draw this to a conclusion. Natalie Tobert asks the question: what happens to those people who can't restrict the data coming into them? I mean, presumably your various subject, your psychic people, do they get diagnosed with mental health problems, or what could we do about that? And are there people who just get too much overload? I mean, does that?
I think it's a really important question. The first thing to say is I truly believe that some people have experiences because of an underlying pathology. And sometimes the experiences they have are framed in terms of things like psychic abilities or spirits and so on. So I think there's absolutely a class of people whose nominally psychic or spiritual experiences are best understood in terms of the biochemistry and biophysiology of the brain. At the same time, I wouldn't at all be surprised to discover that at least some people who have a psychiatric diagnosis of some sort have that diagnosis because of the distress that comes from having conventional spiritual or psychic experiences and not being able to make sense of or integrate or assimilate those experiences. And it goes back to what we've just heard, really, from Julie, the idea that if in childhood people think that you're la-la because you've had these kinds of experiences, that can lead to a lot of trouble for people. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're endorsing pathology in people if you're sympathetic and allow people to explore their experiences in a safe space.
Openness and safety, of course.
Exactly. Astonishingly, we've discovered that the last taboo among psychotherapists and counselors is to talk about paranormal experiences.
Huh.
That for them is a step too far. So if you've had childhood abuse in your life, absolutely we can talk about it. If there are other issues around other forms of abuse, for example, they are absolutely appropriately legitimate things for us to disclose and to explore, try and make sense of, and come out the other side from. But if you've had a profound psychic or paranormal experience, they don't want to know. And
yeah, that's it. The last barrier, the last taboo.
It is. And it really, I think it creates problems for people. We don't have to go so far as to say your experiences were real. So, for example, if you believe that a deceased relative has come through and has been speaking to you, we don't have to endorse the interpretation, but we can absolutely say to those people, that's really interesting. Here are lots of other people who've reported very similar kinds of experience. These are the ways in which they've understood their experiences that's given them comfort. Oh, and by the way, these are people who were healthy and sane before they had that experience, and they continue to be healthy and sane after that experience.
Don't worry. Yeah.
Exactly. Don't worry that this is going to suddenly be the beginning of something for you.
That's really interesting. I've got actually now again 2 questions because we've added a new one. So here's a short one and a long one, and then we will.
Fine.
Leonilla Capron says, is it correct to say that parapsychological experiments are focused on proving psychic phenomena? That's the word she's going for. I mean, are you like a normal scientist trying to prove your stuff?
I think scientists tend not to be in the proof game because we recognize that proof in the legal sense, well, it's kind of like the legal sense. In the definitive sense is impossible.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as a crucial experiment, certainly not in the social sciences. We can have an accumulation of evidence that makes us more confident that a particular way of understanding a phenomenon is along the right track. But I think very quickly, we have to, if we don't want to become sterile, we have to move on to what we call a more process-oriented approach, which is, are there characteristic features of what's going on that give us some kind of insight into the mechanism of what's going on? So that's, for example, why when we work with mediums, we don't do so much of the basic test to say, what information can you provide? Is it accurate? Can we demonstrate that this wasn't down to chance? We're much more interested in the process questions, such as, in what ways do you experience these phenomena? Are some types, some flavors of phenomena more persuasive or evidential than others? Are there particular kinds of evidence that clients are looking for that are more reassuring and comforting for them? You know, those are the lines that we work with.
Yes, of course. And so, I mean, the truth is that you're a social scientist by proclamation. You're not a hard scientist, and that's true of psychologists and sociologists as well. That's great. Peter Bruin has got our last question here, which is quite a one. He wants to talk about psi as a behavior modifier, so sort of predictive.
Okay, yes.
I was married to a woman, he says, who as a student had attended Edinburgh University in the 70s. Unfortunately, she tried to take her own life one night and ended up in hospital. Her mother, with whom she was very close, woke up in her flat on the south side of Glasgow in the middle of the night. Taking her secret savings, she went out onto the deserted Kilmarnock Road and hailed a taxi. She directed the driver all the way to Edinburgh, 55 miles away, went straight to her daughter's hospital bedside. How would a parapsychologist regard or deal with such an event? What are the odds? And what could be taken from it, if anything? A nice little story, that, and one from his own life.
It is absolutely. I think it's a really important and valuable case of human testimony. It doesn't amount to evidence in the scientific sense because of the problems in terms of self-selection and so on that we talked about before. And that is not at all the same as saying that these are valueless cases. I think they're very important. And it's not the only such case. And I think it's really useful for other people to know of cases like that one so that they have that sense that they're not alone in having those real and compelling experiences. One of our side projects is to work with a collection of cases, really. The letters that were collected by Alistair Hardy.
Yeah.
And Alistair Hardy was particularly interested in religiosity and the grounds for people's religiousness, what evidence they saw in their lived experience that convinced them that there was a God, there was something other, something greater than ourselves. There are about 6,000 letters that were collected, and they've been transcribed into a database. And among those is a subset of maybe 900 cases which are parapsychological. So the kind of evidence that people talk about involves exactly these kinds of premonitions, being compelled to act in a particular way, going to somebody's aid. And what's really important about those cases is, even at the time of writing the letters, and the letters might be from the 1950s or 60s, the event happened 40 years previously to that. And what that suggests to me is these experiences are not terribly common. You can't expect dozens and dozens of times for you to be confronted with this aspect of your nature. But those occasions when it does happen are so profound and meaningful to those people that they carry them with them and they sustain them for the rest of their lives. Yes. And if for no other reason, we absolutely have an obligation to take those cases seriously and to offer people some kind of support and a framework through which to understand those. So when we do our Dream ESP experiments, in lots of ways, those experiments are trivial. And, you know, and getting just over 31% of a hit rate is in some ways neither here nor there. But why those experiments are important is because I can talk about those when somebody comes to me and says, in my real life, I had this dream and I feel like this dream later came true. Am I crazy? Is something going on? And I can say, well, no. Or am I deceiving myself? Am I stupid? Well, you can say, well, no, look, here is this objective evidence. And look what this is showing. This is complementing the experience that you're reporting.
Yes, of course. I think that's absolutely right. And how wonderful to think that that is happening. Above all, that thing about people not being alone. A little comment again from Natalie Tobert here, from the Alistair Hardy archive. There were assumptions in that material that if you had a positive experience, it was spiritual or religious. If you had a negative experience, people around you assumed it was mental illness.
Right.
Oh, I met an angel and yeah. But if you met a devil and it was horrible, then you were mad. That sort of thing, I suppose, in those days.
Yeah, I don't quite agree with Natalie on this occasion. I agree with Natalie on most things, but on this occasion, I think for me the telling point is whether people find the experience distressing. And even positive experiences can be distressing. So people can have a very positive near-death experience, for example. And it's so transformative for that person. It turns their life upside down. The incidence of divorce among near-death experiences is through the roof. And it's because one person has changed. Their focus has shifted. Their priorities are different. And their life partner's priorities haven't changed. And so it can turn everything upside down. It can be deeply distressing. So for me, the key to many of those experiences is how do we support people through that process of integrating the experience so they can return to being a functional person again.
Of course, that's terrific, Chris. Thank you very much. I have to say, you are the most clear explainer of things. It's completely
very kind of you. Thank you.
I really do hope, as everyone here does, that you will come back and talk to us again. In fact, there's no escape. Can I just, before I ask everybody to say goodbye and to do a little clapping, could I say that, of course, we have follow-ups, not Chris immediately, but we do have Ian McGilchrist, the author of The Master and His Emissary, coming next Tuesday, who's a really fascinating man. David Punter, who's a professor of Gothic Studies, who is talking about magic the week after. And of course, a man whom I'm really very excited about, Philip Goff, who's the panpsychist, the young, keen philosophy of panpsychism, who is turning aspects of metaphysics upside down. Also, of course, on Saturday nights, we do have mediumship demonstrations at this same time on Zoom, and all of these things you can sign up for. You can go via the website, and the best thing, of course, is to join our mailing list, which is easily done through the website. Isn't that right, Scott? Okay, and finally, I'm taking over the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre as Chairman of Trustees from Anne Traherne, and her parting shot, as most of you know, is that she's written a book about her experiences the book is called Arthur and Me, her experiences with Arthur Conan Doyle, and she's not 150 years old. The experiences were with him from the other side. And her book called Arthur and Me is well worth reading, and you can get it on Amazon. Anne Traherne's Arthur and Me. But it remains simply to, I won't read them all out, but lots of people have said, thank you very much, great talk, thank you so much, I enjoyed it.
Thank you all for turning up.
We all enjoyed it. A little bit of applause, and thank you, Chris, and good night.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Silent applause. We'll see you again soon, dear boy.
Yeah. Bye-bye.